Everyone, thanks so much for joining us. My name is Salman Rafe. I'm the program manager at the Mitchell Institute. This is actually one of our last seminars of the semester and at the end of 2024, really. We're very grateful to have such a nice turnout. This is also, it's always kind of one of our most exciting seminars. We are very lucky at the Mitchell Institute to have a handful of fellows join us each year. And during that time, obviously, our fellows are focused on their scholarship, their research, their experiences learning, connecting with people on campus. And as part of that contract that they sort of agree to with us, we also make them tell us about their work. And so this is the chance where you get to ask our Bajaj Fellow to share their work with us, which is a very exciting experience for all of us and for them. So the Bajaj Fellowship is thanks to the very generous support of the Bajaj family. It's our most recent sort of named fellowship here at the Mitchell Institute. It is a 6-month fellowship. So Nilanjana, who's been our Bajaj Fellow since the beginning of this academic year, is kind of coming towards the end of her fellowship, and it's been a wonderful time having her. I won't give a very extensive introduction to her because I'll leave that to her faculty mentor, but I will introduce her faculty mentor. And again, faculty mentors serve as an advisor and figure of support for our fellows while they're here. And we're very grateful that Professor Robin Kelsey agreed to serve as Nilanjana's mentor during her time on campus with us. To give a full introduction, Professor Kelsey would be probably the length of the full time we have today, about an hour and a half. So I'll kind of be relatively brief, but that shouldn't, make you overlook his extensive experience and accomplishments here on campus and elsewhere. Professor Robin Kelsey is the Shirley Carter Burden Professor of Photography. He's been with the faculty for over 2 decades now. He also previously served as the Dean of Arts and Humanities for the last 8 years, until just very recently.
Right, yes.
Right. And so we're very grateful that he's also, in addition to his many other accomplishments, which again I can get into, a prior doctorate degree from Harvard, prior experience at Yale Law School. He was also the co-chair of the Harvard University Committee on the Arts, and he's also agreed to be one of our faculty mentors this year. So again, we're very grateful for Professor Kelsey's support on this. Professor Kelsey is a specialist in the histories of photography, modernism, and American art, and has published on topics such as the role of chance in photography, geographical survey photography, landscape theory, ecology, and historical interpretation, picture theory, and the nexus of art and law. So again, I can just keep going, and I would be inclined to do so. I'll have to get you for another talk at some point. But this time is Nilanjana's show, but I'll turn it over to Professor Kelsey to introduce our fellow. So thank you all for joining and looking forward to this.
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be here and to see such a wonderful and lively audience here today. So Professor Nilanjana Mukherjee received her PhD in 2011 from JNU in New Delhi and has taught English literature at the undergraduate and graduate levels at Delhi University for nearly 2 decades. Her scholarship has explored issues of cultural and political geography with a particular emphasis on notions of space, place, landscape, and cartography in literary narratives and in visual cultures. She traces these matters from the cartographic imagination of British everyday practices of the present, carefully charting, if I may say, the intersection of local ways of knowing or traversing with national and colonial regimes. Beyond these core concerns, she is interested in, among other things, the nexus of gender and nationalism, Bangla literature, and Indian art movements. Her book, Spatial Imaginings in the Age of Colonial Cartographic Reason, Maps, Landscapes, Travelogues in Britain and India, came out from Routledge in 2020. And she has also co-edited the volume Mapping India, Transitions and Transformations, 18th and 19th centuries, also published by Routledge in 2019. Professor Mukherjee is recipient of the Delhi University Foundation Day Award for Teaching Excellence, and she has also been awarded the Meenakshi Mukherjee Memorial Prize from the Indian Association of Commonwealth Literature and Language Studies, which goes to a member of the association who has written the best article in the previous 2 years. She was the Charles Wallace India Trust Visiting Fellow at the Institute of Advanced Studies in the Humanities at the University of Edinburgh, and a doctoral fellow at King's College London. And it has been a great pleasure to serve or as her official mentor here at Harvard during her Bajaj Visiting Fellowship. And that I will add that in that capacity, I've had the dubious distinction of learning far more from Professor Mukherjee than I imparted to her. But sometimes that's how these relationships proceed. As we shall hear today, Professor Mukherjee has been working this fall on a study of the Indian desert as a spatial imaginary in the history as a frontier zone in Northwest India. And her talk is entitled Unmapping the Thar, the Desert Reimagined. Please join me in welcoming Professor Nilanjana Mukherjee.
Good morning and welcome, everybody. It is so heartening to see all of you here. Almost all, the people that I have invited personally have turned up, turned in here. So it's absolutely very heartening and heartwarming. For the ease and the time constraint, I'm going to read from a paper. So without further adieus, I think I will go straight to my paper and then we can have questions in the end. In this talk, I have decided to speak about my personal journey and encounter with the desert, something which I found courage to do only in Harvard. In the many talks that I attended in the last few months, I came across speakers and scholars repeatedly speaking about their doubts, frustrations, and personal quest in the course of their scholarship journey, which I found very inspiring. For me, this is the best approach to my engagement here right now, since this work is far from over and should be best treated as work in progress. Two questions I repeatedly encounter in casual conversations here are why I choose to work on the desert, possibly because I come from a tropical green part of India, and people generally expect scholars to speak about the environment they come from. And the second, what are the archives I am looking at among Harvard's many resources? Hopefully, the talk will address both these. For reference, the desert land I am going to talk about is found in the western and northwestern part of India, in the states of Rajasthan and Gujarat, today sharing an international boundary with Pakistan. Topographically, it becomes the last edges of almost a continuous stretch of arid zone, stretched from North Africa through the Central Asian steppes before giving way to the fertile Doab River bed of monsoon Asia. In the past, my work has been on colonial cartographic practices, looking at how empires gain a concrete national contour through spatial practices like maps, landscape paintings, and travel literature, taking a comparative and unitary frame of analysis between Great Britain and India. That work involved careful navigation and search in the colonial archives. The study led to questions of spatialization and territorialization and how landscapes and topographies are shaped not merely physically through human hands, but also imaginatively by fashioning our emotional and affective responses towards them. Following Henry Lefebvre, we know that literature, philosophy, and art too play a vital role in doing this and therefore can squarely be referred to as cartographic practice. It becomes a way to order geographical knowledge into a digest. This understanding resulted in my questioning figurations of borders, bordering practices, and borderlands as outcomes of cartographic processes through an approach that is called critical cartography or a critical geography. This approach critiques mapping as a language of power, creating structures of state sovereignty and legal monism. Being a student of literature, this was also a natural outcome of reading works of great and influential writers like Rabindranath Tagore, Saadat Hossain Manto, and Amitav Ghosh, to name only a few. Simultaneously, on my many visits to the desert regions of Rajasthan, I was struck by the contradiction between how the desert has been perceived and its reality. I had imagined a desert right from my childhood as a never ending and unforgiving geography of long caving strings of sand dunes, mirages, which disoriented coordinates, and as an empty landscape where the only sound would be the sound of strong gushing winds. Thanks to picture books, photographs, movies, not to mention poetry, which reaffirm these cliches. In English poetry, take for example Andrew Marvell's To His Coy Mistress. But at my back, I always hear time's winged chariot hurrying near, and yonder all before us lie deserts of vast eternity. Or, say, Eliot's classic The Wasteland. What are the roots that clutch? What branches grow out of this stony rubbish? Son of man, you cannot say or guess, for you know only a heap of broken images where the sun beats and the dead tree gives no shelter, the cricket no relief, and the dry stone no sound of water. Or even Omar Khayyam's Rubaiyat. With me along some strip of herbage strewn that just divides the desert from the zone, where name of slave and sultan scarce is known. This binary of the desert and the zone is an important category to interpret aesthetic paradigms originating in Central Asia. In fact, the garden imagery, with its primary botany of flowering trees in architecture, art, sculpture, and textiles, is a predominant trope which is premised on the difference between land which is irrigated, in other words, able engineering to tap water, and that which is not. The the sighting of promised flowering trees was thought of as an equivalent to the sacred sighting of paradise or Jannat. It becomes a holy duty almost to bring to blossom the desert and fashion it into a spring well of flora and fauna. The underlying idea is that there is water, a life giving sacred resource underneath, underground, even amidst arid spaces, even if hidden, which is to be brought to the surface through labor and human industry. By this logic, the separation was between life and non life, between Adam's Eden and the wilderness Adam and Eve are banished into. These ideas are not unique to Islam or Christianity, but are prevalent in other belief systems as well. Therefore, the desert was something and somewhere where life, if at all, stands still, crystallized in the form of aerial shots of long line of camel riders casting long shadows on the sand. These images gel well with the imagination of the desert being a natural boundary, borderland between and punctuating civilizations, as though these impenetrable in-between regions were divinely ordained to fortify those geographies meant to nourish human industry. In a quintessentially colonial territorial format, these borderlands are constructed as curious places, nowhere lands with uneasy landscapes, mobility impeding dangerous tracts of land, which are impervious to spatial discipline, peopled by unruly and deceitful tribes. This geographical stretch, which evolved as a frontier zone due to British imperial transactions and geopolitical stakes, as well as due to politico-economic exigencies of a specific logic of the colonial state, is embraced as a rationale, format, and layout by present-day post-colonial state, where this desert's location at the fringes, as though guarding the mainland, is justified. There is a long line of colonial travelogues by British surveyors whose language construct the arid region as an insurmountable barrier very often. A couple would be enough to demonstrate here. James Todd himself, who is by far the most famous, in his Annals and Antiquities of Rajasthan, this is in the early 19th century, describing his journey from Jodhpur, observed how, on crossing the seasonal Luni River, the sand became heavier, making it look the veritable region of death, as the name Marwar or Maruwar or Death Land would suggest. However, he was struck by the speed of the camels and of the local Marwaris, who appeared to move through it as briskly as our men or on the plains of the Ganges. Even before Todd, colonial agents on numerous diplomatic and political missions, such as Henry Pottinger's travels in Baluchistan and Sindh, Captain Hart's travel to Hinglaj, Francis Wilfor's Frederick Goldsmith's proceedings on his political mission to Makran, perceived and reviewed the region's status in a way which reduced the region as an effective frontier zone. In fact, this hyper-arid region was recognized in the West as Jedrosia, or Alexander the Great's death trap, which put a death nail to his imperial expansionist ambitions. Therefore, it was already a region predisposed to being perceived as a strategic death shield, which could even curb the universal gaze of Alexander. Again, when Lieutenant Alexander Bolu travels through the desert in 1835, it is primarily for three reasons: settle border contentions between local groups, find and record existing routes of transport and trade, and to test out opportunities for revenue expansion. Bolu describes facets of the desert in passages which express anxiety of wayfaring and a fear of losing one's way amidst widespread sand and dunes, which disrupt every attempt to chalk a pathway. The only way to negotiate this wild and dangerous terrain was through a heavy reliance on camel tracks, as also the camels themselves and on the North Star for direction. This apparent break with fixed space transforms one into a nomad through a loss of the world. Yet he sees in this unceasing desolation a possibility of future stabilization. Only if vegetation is allowed to take root on the sand and bind the soil, making the place possible for inhabitation in future. In another part of his account, on speaking about revenues from the Rawal's territory in Jaisalmer, Bolu provides a lot of statistics but mentions all of it being duties on the transit of trade goods on the way to the company's territories or from Rajwara to Hind. This is telling of the locality's inadequacy in generating its own revenue from agriculture, as it is, according to him, barren all, as he, again, in his words, scarcely saw a single cornfield in traversing 200 miles of this country, and also because of the presence of insubordinate subjects like the Bhattis, who are almost personified extension of the untamed landscape. What this kind of colonial travel literature simultaneously does is construct the desert as a region evading cartographic logic and therefore is perceived as waste, especially when accounted in terms of its failure to respond to demands of revenue in a capitalist imperial order. Hence, in the colonial imagination, it gets its inevitable fate of being harnessed to other significant geographies of power. Also, what it does is to bring under the radar of suspicion and surveillance mobile nomadic groups operating in this region. British residents posted at the Rajputana provinces repeatedly advised the Bengal government to bring the regions under structured agricultural cultivation. In almost all the above mentioned treatises and memoirs maintained by the surveyors, there are repeated records of personal experiences of harassment, deception, and treachery at the hands of wild and uncontrolled inhabitants and their habits of plundering and raiding. In other words, inhabitants of these lands were seen as evading principles of moral conduct, being stateless, just as the desert terrain stood as a rupture to regulative aesthetics, which got based on colonial principles of political and economic knowledge and apparatus of security. The desert's apparent stationary state of unproductivity through the optics of stadial development economics arrive from a colonial agrarian rationality derived from a recognizable Scottish Enlightenment discourse on land cultivation and use. Virtue and progress, character and industry, conduct and economy were the paired keywords of colonial governance. In this regime of value, such terrains of wastelands performed an important and significant function of becoming insulating periphery or deep frontier. As Heinz Softner states in his study of war and geography, large areas difficult to traverse, such as deserts and mountains, uniformly favor the defender and impeded the attacker, whereas the more industrial and populous areas were highly vulnerable. In talking about the First World War maps, Softner shows how regions on these maps are left white as they are considered empty and of negligible military or industrial value, except that they shut off or provide access to more significant areas. In this respect, most of Australian and the deserts of Africa and Asia are left white on the map. Similarly, colonial explorers in the 19th century found the interiors of Australia a desert, which they understood as fundamentally resistant to imperial penetration and could be accessed only through indigenous knowledge. The reliance on native and non-human intelligence was considered almost shameful in a quintessential colonial regime and could be refuted and rescued only through authentic first-person reconnaissance in order to probe for possibilities to insinuate imperial designs in the land of slow time and primordial knowledge. Within this territorial design, therefore, the widespread nomadic pastoralism and their peripatetic livelihood that was part and parcel of the desert life and the desert's own connectedness was perceived with great suspicion, as much as eliding surveillance with their unruly behavior and free movement, apparently berating imperial colonial vector of modern capital, which came from the sea. In another sense, the desert rivaled and disrupted the triumph and spatial progression of imperial geography by highlighting the limits of waterborne vector and making it bend to the realities of landscape and nature. However, just like in Brodel's long-durée assessment of the Mediterranean, the Sahara Desert is posited as the other side to the circulation by sea. One can trace an uninterrupted parallel overland pan-Asian, even transcontinental connectivity across the desert, which could be seen as the flip side of European imperial vitality on the sea route. In fact, a deeper analysis will encourage reading the specific colonial spatial layout and plans in the northwestern part of India as resulting from the needs to curb the overland circulation, which are perceived as a pilferage and drainage to colonial resource accretion. Deserts and mountains are also coincidentally those conventional geographies where pastoral nomadism is pushed to, as regions more fertile are assigned to agriculture. The deserts in this part of the world were connected to far-flung areas such as Inner Asia, the Arab world, and even Africa through routes of trade and commerce and for matters of faith and religion in the ancient and the medieval world. Camel caravans or kafilas in Arabic traverse the region for centuries. The still image created largely by photography of camels traveling in a line in unchanging sand dunes is of course a misnomer. Landscape changed continuously and so did the routes depending on weather conditions. The routes were usually seasonal depending on agricultural calendar which determined the start of the caravan. The seasons marked the important phases of the yearly cycle of transhumance. Every caravan depended on a vast network of intelligence about water holes and grazing, which in turn depended on shared route planning, information on potential markets, or about volatile political conditions along the way with other caravaneers, leaders, and entire community of merchants and breeders. Ibn Battuta, a 14th century Moroccan traveler, noted the encyclopedic knowledge of his blind camel puller during his trans-Saharan rihala or travel to India, commenting on his special ability to recognize the route despite his blindness. As Latimore, this is early part of 20th century, points out in his Mongol journeys, over many centuries, camel nomads acquired subtle ecological knowledge about the environment and of the animals they managed. Apart from the dead reckoning, measuring distance in terms of time, astroplanetary knowledge of direction through location of celestial bodies or winds, there were other more intimate ways of recognizing routes. In the course of his travel, Latimore observes how older herdsmen developed the acumen to recognize the accurate route through smell of earth of the track. The spatial knowledge was not merely ocular-centric, but resulted out of a relationship with the inhabited environment. The herders and nomadic knowledge involved recognition and identification of patches of vegetation, and their spatial cognition evolved out of their relationship with animals. Shepherds traditionally developed deep sensuous knowledge of geographical diversity and likewise had a rich vocabulary attached to every physical terrain, linked with animal phenotypes belonging to distinct geographies, even though deserts are generally perceived as featureless. These subtle changes in landscape were identified through an alternative way of negotiating the land, often manifested as spiritual connection to the sacred, and therefore to stories transmitted through generations of herders. The trusted partnership between people and animals have given rise to an alternative mobile life world and pattern of geographical consciousness and aspiration which settled societies can seldom envisage. Anthony Sattin's book, Nomads, The Wanderers Who Shaped Our World, explores the historical and cultural impacts of nomadic peoples, emphasizing their often overlooked role in shaping civilization. He highlights the tension and interdependence between nomadic and sedentary societies, using examples from history and epics to show how mobility influenced trade, innovation, and societal structures. Satin argues that modern histories often neglect nomadic contributions because they prioritize written records, which are predominantly the domain of sedentary cultures. This bias excludes the rich oral tradition and decentralized ways of living practiced by nomads. He also critiques the modern emphasis on progress, suggesting that nomadic lifestyles with their minimal ecological footprint provides lessons in sustainability and living harmoniously with nature. Nomadic communities in history were powerful groups on whom states and empires relied on for state support and warfare. British forces manifestly realized the need to harness animal potential and even undertook to bring out studies about animal management and indigenous belief systems regarding animals. This is Lockwood Kipling's Beast and Man in India, which mentions numerous species of camels according to region of provenance and features, their cultural significance and use. There existed various camel corps across the Eurasian arid zone, the French, the Ottoman, and the British. Camels, with their unique ability to navigate harsh terrains, were integral to the colonial military presence in arid regions, facilitating both conquest and control, while deeply intertwining with the cultural and logistical fabric of colonial rule. During the Great Game Eurasian politics, both the Russian and the British on both ends had no choice other than to rely on nomadic groups for transportation, communication, and logistics. Colonial armies often relied on local guides and camel handlers who were familiar with the terrain. This created a complex dynamic where colonial forces were dependent on indigenous expertise while simultaneously dominating the local population. In some regions, camels and their riders became symbols of colonial domination. The colonial powers often leveraged the image of camel mounted troops to demonstrate their adaptation to local conditions and their capability to project power even in the most challenging terrains. The history of nomadism and pastoralism is not a simple one, nor is it the same in all places. In many parts of the world, it has evolved out of the needs of agrarian and military societies, but developing a complex relationship with the state, with periods of ascending and retreating influence upon state instruments. As Gomans has pointed out, how pastoralism in the steppe corridor developed, developed based on the military needs of the medieval empires operating in Asia. Similarly, other historians of later periods talk about the growth and significance of animal trade around European colonial designs and purposes of colonial transport and warfare. Through these studies, one can enter the domain of discussion of how physical environments undergo transformation in material and physical terms depending on the requirements. However, cultural perspectives on the intricate relationship of land, animals, and ecology with the trajectory of human evolution and of the consequent shaping of values in community life is another dimension which needs to be addressed. In other words, the partnership and cooperation between human and non-human and inter species affect in shaping environments in a transhuman's life world is a less discussed area which is nonetheless gaining traction in present scholarship. Pre-modern kingdoms had a complex relationship with pastoral groups. The Raika or the Ribari, one of the largest pastoral groups in the western part of the Indian subcontinent, grazed the herds of the nobility, took over sparsely inhabited tracts of land, and had access to the commons. The colonial state, in contrast, was oriented to sedentarization. British domination affected South Asian nomadism drastically either by curbing it or increasing their migration phases by forcing the nomads to seek new pastures and moving continuously. Forest laws enacted after 1860 restricted access to forest and commons. We'll see a short video of the people that I'm talking about.
Sorry about this all.
So you might be wondering, I mean, why it doesn't look arid enough. This is just the start of the monsoon, and with one single wash, the landscape transforms completely, and then there's greenery all over. And the same landscape, if you go in winter, it will be completely cracked and parched. And they start their migration at around that time. In fact, it is a seasonal one. They're never, stagnant. They're never static. They move around. So one of the remnants of early medieval routes of nomadic circulation are these Raikas of Rajasthan and Gujarat. They are known for their deep-rooted connection to livestock herding, particularly of camels, sheep, and goats. This community has historically played a significant role in maintaining ecological balance in arid and semi-arid regions through sustainable grazing practices and intimate knowledge of their environment. The Maru Raikas, that is the desert Raikas, and Godwar Raikas, the ones who live on the hills, the Aravali hills, represent subgroups within this broader community, each associated with specific regions and cultural practices. The Maru Raikas are primarily found in the Thar Desert region of Rajasthan, including areas like Jodhpur, Barmer, and Jaisalmer. They are traditionally associated with camel herding, an essential livelihood in the desert landscape, where camels are invaluable for transportation, milk, and dung used as fuel. The Maru Raikas view themselves as custodians of camel breeding, and their expertise is often linked to specific breeds, such as the Tharparkar camel or other hardy desert breeds. They practice nomadic or semi nomadic pastoralism, moving across vast distances to find grazing for their animals. They often worship deities like Pabuji, a local folk deity considered the patron of camels and herders. The Godwar Raikas are centered in the Aravali Hills at the edge of the desert or Godwar region, which covers parts of the Pali, Sirohi, and Jalore districts in southern Rajasthan. While they also rear camels, the Godwar Raikas are more diversified in livestock management and are known for rearing sheep and goats in addition to camels. Compared to the Maru Raikas, they are today more sedentarized. One is likely to encounter the Raika shepherd in their visit to Rajasthan and to witness landscapes and streets thronging with animals. One can see flocks of sheep and goats, herds of cows and camels let loose in the arid soil, munching on sparse desert vegetation, with or without a lone Raika shepherd by their side. The Maru and Godwar Raikas represent not just a livelihood, but a way of life deeply intertwined with the desert landscape, showcasing resilience and adaptation over centuries. Their traditions and knowledge remain invaluable to uh, understanding and preserving Rajasthan's unique desert ecology. Their circular nomadism is based on recognition and familiarity, in contrast to arrow-like invader nomadism, in which groups leave the territory after it is exhausted. Can show another video where the grazing is going on. They're taking the camels out early in the morning to graze.
더 늘리지게 더 나와줘 예 예. 네네네 아 하. 예. 하. 예. 예.
So this is a sound that they make with peculiar sound that the camels understand.
예. 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 하. 예. 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 어디야?
The grazier is a solitary man. His job requires him to be vigilant always. During a conversation on asking what an older grazier does during the long hours when the animals are grazing after the ivar or the flock or herd has reached the gochard or pasture, he says he thinks about his ivar. the problems faced by them with the disappearance of grazing grounds, their poverty, and the feasts that have to be given, the world created by the Almighty. Experimentation with new vegetation that he has not seen earlier by tasting or rubbing on the skin are common, as is observing insects, birds, and animals. Knowledge thus gathered is remembered and shared with co-herdsmen. Things have changed with the younger generation though, as mobile phone and reel culture has taken over this time and a lot of sharing happens over internet. Due to the fall in requirement of camels today, this community and livelihood pattern is fast shrinking and is coerced to do what it was prohibited to do earlier, that is sale of milk of their animals. The indigenous geographical consciousness represented in their oral literature is comparable with Australian Aboriginal songline or dreaming tracks, serving as oral maps, and can be seen as giving an alternative to cartographic linearity by creating a storied landscape bound by affect and sacredness. They connect different regions and communities, weaving a network of cultural and spiritual pathways across the continent. They preserve knowledge about the environment, survival techniques, and cultural practices. They are passed down through generations, often through ceremonies, storytelling, and song. They may also indicate forgotten connections and roots which pre-existed modern emergence of states. Yeah. The ancient pilgrimage town of Pushkar was an important destination for nomadic life and literature due to several reasons and is still kept alive through traditions and narratives. It was a lake and oasis perched amidst the desert sands on the edge of the hills. The autumn fair of Pushkar is usually timed to culminate in Kartik Purnima or the full moon night in November, considered to be the most fruitful or auspicious time of the year for those taking a dip in the Pushkar Lake. For soteriological ends, consists of a circuit of places going from east to west, starting and ending with Pushkar, and its importance is highlighted by equating the benefits of visiting or contemplating visiting Pushkar with the benefits from all other places. Pushkar was thus a crucial node for trade as well as pilgrimage circuits within and beyond Rajasthan, and its significance is reflected in its role in Rajasthani life, culture, and literature. Interestingly, Pushkar plays an important role in almost all nomadic narratives from the region, and especially the epic of Pabuji, which is centered on the travels and exploits of a Rajput martyr, Pabuji, and his Bhil, Raika, and other tribal friends, wandering in and beyond the desert, protecting or stealing cattle, marrying women, fighting battles, and more, was probably been in circulation in the Thar region from the 16th century and could be related to a historical Pabuji, a Rajput prince. He is credited to have brought a particular breed of camel to Marwar from Lanka or Sri Lanka with the help of his friend Harmal Raika. Every Raika settlement has a shrine or temple dedicated to Pabuji. In the long cloth paintings sacred to the hero deity, in front of which his epic is narrated and performed, um, the pictures on the card represent the major events and characters in the narrative according to a logic of epic geography, a sort of epic map. Within the logic of this geography, the primary characteristic defining a scene is not when it took place, but where, so that events that are close to each other on the path don't follow each other in temporality, but are placed next to each other because they happened close to each other in space. Of course, this requires a certain elasticity to accommodate all the events within a demarcated frame. Spaces can be read as compressed or stretched depending on narrative requirements. Varying scales are used to depict characters, usually according to their importance. The same scenes, acts, and characters can be used to depict multiple narrative elements and moments in the text. Pushkar becomes the epicenter where humans and non humans congregate to remember a former way of being, which is crystallized in ballads and songs and epic narrations of Babuji by specialist musicians playing on an instrument, which too is reminiscent of that ancient connection. This is called the Ravanhatta or Ravanstrom, a stringed violin made of coconut shell, goat membrane, and horse hair. And the term Ravanhatta means Ravan's hand, which this too originated in Sri Lanka, adding another layer to this region's connected history. Such oral narratives open up myriad possibilities to understand the world in its polyvalent multiplicity, fluid and mobile, as the sandscapes, its people and animals embedded in thick time, making the periphery into a temporary center. Deleuze and Guattari's conceptualization of the desert as a smooth space, as opposed to striated space, is helpful in understanding the situation of the pastoralists here. Smooth spaces are often fluid, undivided, and unregulated terrains of possibility, as opposed to the structured hierarchical spaces of organization and control. Desert, as the nomad's natural habitat, becomes a space of resistance and creation, a zone where new modes of existence can emerge free from rigid control. However, the state always tries to weigh down on and streamline nomadic ways. The desert cannot be taken as empty or silent, but an unbounded field of possibility, albeit a space silenced in the archives. These empty spaces have absorbed characters and actions. In the colonial cartographic form, the element of time and temporality, flux and vicissitudes of the land, and the bodies moving within space are completely missing, creating the desert as an abstraction. However, on the contrary, the desert can be imagined as an interstitial space of freedom and liberty to find alternatives to fixed forms of understanding the world. Within the striated legibility of capitalist cartography, based on production and consumption, which only reads certain kind of land usage as ownership, can oral traditions and livelihood patterns of cyclical nomadism on the desert peripheries, where there is no growth without a conquest, and definitely no stationary occupation of land, be recognized as the performative element of law and cartography.
Thank you so much. While people are thinking about what they want to ask you, I'm going to start out with a couple of questions. And the first two are methodological, and one has to do with how you began, where you talked about voice and using the first person, and that being at Harvard had, you said, given you the courage to move into that first-person voice. And I was just curious if you could say more about that and how you feel that that has allowed you to re-grasp or rethink your project and how you might be thinking about voice moving forward with this.
Um, Taking it from there, I think, this is a space where much literature is not available. Of course, there's only oral culture, and you have to really go and do field work, talk to the people, interview them, and be with them in order to understand that. In Harvard, I saw scholar after scholar just presenting their frustration with the kind of work that they do. They are confused and they're unabashedly so. And I think that is a way of, approaching your work. In his class, in Rahul Mehrotra's class, he's continuously said that in this world, if you are confused, you are thinking straight. So this is something which I have. This is something which I have, come to admire in Harvard, and this has also given me the approach.
That's really helpful, and it actually relates to my next question, which is you made so clear the extent to which in the imperial imaginary there is a desire for fixity, for these abstractions that don't change, and you set in contradistinction the way of living that we saw represented in the videos and so subtly described by you. But I was thinking too that even our methodologies as scholars bear a lot of inheritance from the imperial imagination, and the extent to which texts and their fixity, historical records and their fixity have been given a kind of special privilege. So I just wondered if you could say a little bit more about negotiating in a space where you are looking at oral traditions that have been often disparaged as unreliable vis-a-vis these more fixed records, and how you think about that.
So there is one, he is an anthropologist, and he has done his work all his life residing in the deserts, and his work is commendable, and that is somebody called Komal Kothari. And he has gone around for 50 years collecting story after story from villages, and he's discovered through the stories there is an immense amount of connections that he draws with the people and their migration routes all across this region, even to Pakistan and beyond, and how they have moved, especially women. We think women to be, more sedentary, they're within the family, but they're marrying and they're continuously moving. So the stories and the songs, women's songs, they give an indication about how people have moved from place to place. How they are related to culture. For example, it is related to cuisine and the ways of cooking. For example, the instruments that are played simultaneously with the women's songs are often kitchen instruments, very simple, basic kitchen instruments. It relates to the kind of grains that are grown in that region, the grasses that grow in that belt, and how, that leads to certain kind of grounding, pounding, or, boiling, and the vessels that come out of that cuisine. So it's a different way and method of looking at stories and finding about these journeys, rather than looking at colonial maps or surveys. They were rather like Todd himself. He also moved around places collecting stories, but he was doing that more as a colonial administrator. He was looking at it from and looking at elite sections of the society, at the genealogies, and people who were actually, giving stories and of the might, the uh, the warriorhood, celebrating the warriorhood of the people of this region, etc. That is like another part of the history that we come across from this region. It is a very well documented history that this region has, because there were genealogists all along, and there were scribes who were recording history, but sometimes they were, I mean, not sometimes, mostly they were commissioned histories for the courts. So
Yeah.
they all they praised the
Yes.
state
Yes.
rather than talk about the rural culture, the farmers, the migrants, and the nomads.
Thank you. That's so helpful. I love that example of the using the kitchen utensils and instrumentation and that being related to the local food sources. That's absolutely fascinating. So in contrast to this notion of the desert as a vast eternity, an unchanging place, this must be a very dynamic time for the Raikas for many reasons, including climate change. And you mentioned the gravitation, in some cases among younger generations, from oral transmission to the internet as a means of communication. Could you say more about these changes and how they're affecting your scholarship and your approach to this subject?
So, the bias that I talked about, which was seemingly so important with the colonial administrators, has carried forward with the present state, and this form of sedentarization is so prevalent, and the lure of sedentary lifestyle has become an aspiration among these people. So many of them just they want to give up their work if they get some permanent work with the government sector, etc. So it's very difficult for them. Of course, the commons are shrinking. They have very little access to green pasture land. Also, their negotiation with the agricultural sector, which that kind of bonding with the agricultural sector, where manuring was a part of this entire industry, that they moved around, moved from place to place. They used to be stationary at some point in one agricultural area, and then they would the camels would manure that place. So that was the give and take, the exchange economy. So that has reversed completely. The agriculturalists and the farmers do not want them in their areas, because they think that the camels will kind of destroy the crops or trample on the ground, and that it's completely needless. So their space has shrunk.
Right, right. Thank you for that. Before opening it up, I'm just going to say that one of the great pleasures for me in this fall and working together is realizing how many connections and parallels there are in the work that I've done on the US-Mexico border in the 19th century and some of the colonial history that you have excavated, particularly the way that an abstract, fixed notion of a boundary gets translated into pictorial genres. I mean, you gave the example of the line of camels and the way in which that corresponds to that abstract boundary. And the same thing happens in the context with which I'm more familiar. And it just made me think that there may be comparative room for conferences or workshops around comparative studies of borders and deserts.
Yes, that is one of the reasons why I made this application, because I wanted to locate this part of India in context and in relationship with other deserts that are there in the world, and whether similar things. And I found immense amount of connections. For example, the date seeds, then the camels themselves being imported to places in Arizona and the deserts here. So they're Arab Omani dates and Omani camels, which were imported here because they do well. So the idea was, they'll serve the same purpose
Right.
here.
Right.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. All right, let's open it up for questions. I see a hand immediately.
Thank you, Nilani. A really great talk. I really liked it. And that's what we historians also do in a way, when we look to the colonial history and criticize them. But apart from, looking to the colonial ethnography and their notion of Thar deserts, people or culture or society, we all know that they were everywhere colonialism or imperialism is to get revenue, money, or exploit the resources. Their intention was only to exploit them rather than to give you your notion of history, culture, or society, whatever, right? Uh, but but apart from that, if you talk about the archives or the places where we will get, even if there is a different kind of the knowledge, we always go to archives. And they were the only people who collected the information. And that's how you referred here Komal Kothari. It was his effort. He knows he delivered or discussed with the Rustam Barucha and he no state it was not a state effort to collect the culture or society or the way of living of the people of India in post-colonial times when we are now independent. So apart and also when we are writing history of subalterns, right? Apart from that, you said that of course their idea was elitist, tapping the elitist people, the influential one, while they are going to the like Todd you
The
discussed,
Rajput warriors.
in the Rajasthan and all. But apart from that, in other way, if you look to the large ethnography of colonialism, it's also give kind of the material on the subaltern culture. Look to the North Indian ethnography on popular culture, religion, Grierson, William Crook, and many. So looking to both kind of the idea, colonialism as not giving a true information, but colonialism as a store of information.
Yeah.
And post-colonial state is giving nothing, then we are criticizing them. How?
Yeah.
Can you
That
also,
is-
oh, sorry to interrupt, but
yeah.
can we also ask if people are asking questions from, if you could just also introduce yourselves as well?
Yeah,
So-
okay. My name is Ashutosh Kumar. I'm visiting professor here at the Vedarat Center for International Affairs. I teach history. I'm professor of history in Banaras Hindu University, India.
Yeah, so in a way you are right, because even today, history that is being written, even by historians, very established historians, they go back to say the resources which are generated by the colonial administrators or people. So basically our academics is completely reliant on archives. This is what I started with. So when I came here, people generally ask me what are the archives that you are working with, because it's very rich in archives. So you do not have to go to the archives in order to study the people, the environment, and the animals. Yeah. So these are alternative ways and methods. I'm trying to approach it through an alternative way. Yeah, so colonial archives won't help to some extent. When I am critiquing the colonial efforts, I have to go to the writings of the British. But otherwise, when I want to understand indigenous people's culture and their traditions, I do not have to really go to the colonial archives for doing that.
Yeah.
Wonderful, yes.
Thank you so much for the presentation.
Could you identify yourself first?
Yes,
Yeah.
Yeah, I go to the graduate school of design, and this is very interesting to me because a little bit of my work is in Ladakh, and I've also sort of spent some time with the Jhamkhar community there. I was wondering, like, I have two questions actually. The first one is that while you were looking at the colonial archive and sort of figuring out what to look at and what not to look at, were there instances of like practices which were sort of curbed during the trigonometric survey? Because I have been able to identify some of those in the Ladakh Himalayan regions, where some counter cartographic practices emerged and they were trying to compete with these British cartographies. And they are very interesting and how obviously they were eventually turned and they sort of, and then the second question building off of that is that during our field work and looking at the archive which was colonial, what according to you would be a counter cartography or because I mean I go to the School of Design, so a lot of my questions are based off of okay, we look at maps and then we deal with them.
Exactly.
If our maps are like they have colonial roots, we're probably like we locate in Thiruvannamalai essentially. But so I mean with all your field work, we would sort of
Yeah, so in the initial period of colonial mapping in these areas, the British were skirting certain areas because they were not happy with the kind of collaboration that they could build up with certain Rajputana states. So there were many, Rajputana is a broad category, but there were small princely states which were very powerful. They had their territorial kind of distinction. So those kind of facts could not be reached in the say early part of later part of 18th century and early part of 18th century. Later on, with the advances and collaboration with the various princely states, there were progresses. And also in the 19th century, there was the great game, as I mentioned, the great game, that fear, that anxiety, which kind of gave the impetus to the British to, do this, to undertake this in a big way. This, the Marathas were actually the contenders with the Rajputana. So they were very afraid. All the kind of sea routes, right, from Bombay to Rajputana and to Gujarat and then inwards through the Thar was the dominant way for many of the trades in this hinterland zone during the age of the British. However, in the overland trade earlier than this, there was a caravan trade, as I mentioned, from Lahore to Afghanistan and the steppes, which kept changing. It was fluctuating all the time. During the 19th century, the Russians actually consolidated. They closed off certain routes. They initiated new routes, new trade routes. And therefore, there was this fear and anxiety that the Russians are going to take over and curb trade and surpluses for the British. So that was the immediate impetus to, kind of map these areas. And also to map it in order to go and, campaign, go for campaigns. For example, the Afghan War. There were 2 Afghan wars which happened. So that was the immediate impetus in the 19th century for mapping. As for your second question, I think I have responded to your first question, why, at what point of time they started mapping and whether there was a counterculture. So certain princely states did not allow them. They were very suspicious about mapping their territory. So that was one of the answers. And the second, the answer to your second question is that these are the countercultures of, in a way, I can see these kind of routes which move, which give a direction, which give primarily mapping is for mobility, right? Going from one place to another. It's a memory aid at the end of the, so this is like you have to look into, again, the scriptural tradition of the textual tradition, that you have to look at a piece of paper to understand what are your routes of navigation. So these people did not require that. There were songs, there were, other kind of memory aids which told them that this is the way, this is the way.
Yes, please.
My name is Sarah Umar. I'm a Fulbright fellow at Methil. I wanted to ask, you said there were court histories during that time period and there were colonial histories as well, and we have archives of these as well. What I wanted to ask was, when you were tracing the oral tradition, were you able to identify what were the differences or what were the similarities between colonial, court, and oral tradition that you traced?
Court and courtly tradition of recording history is completely different. It is, in terms of its eulogic. So praising the, the conquest in a war, the winning of of the king. It's completely euphoric, and there's a lot of praise happening. So in this culture, also you have, for example, in Pabuji's epic, there will be a lot of praise, etc. But they also deal with certain characteristics which are not such important, so very important in the other paradigm. They are also talking about animal characters, right, who become very important. The kind of protection that uh, these kind of heroes give to the animals. They're dying in order to defend the animals. So, the centrality of animals in these stories is far, far greater than the kind of symbolism, the victorious narrative that is played around with in the other kind of courtly narrative tradition.
So it would mean that what the livelihood of the people have been absent from the archives, the court archives and the colonial archives as
Yes,
well.
yes, it is more about conquest and defense.
And nothing about what the
Nothing
people at
of-
that time period were doing. So that means we have absolutely no history related to that.
Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Baba. I'm a first year PhD student in the history department. Thank you so much for the talk. One thing that came to my mind when you were talking initially about imperial imagination and how they viewed the people as being defined by their ecology and landscape reminded me of northwest frontier region of Pakistan, bordering Afghanistan.
Yeah.
Like there to Jagjit Lali's work shows that like Afghan race and religion was seen as entangled with like the particularities of that region and mountains and like that hence they were unruly and but like then the British imposed like a very different system of governance, frontier crimes regulation, which is different from like the colonial rule in other areas. Do we see that in this region? Like were they governed differently from other regions or not? One question. And secondly, how did partition affect these communities? And their livelihood and everything, if you could just comment a little bit on that.
Yeah. I'll take this question and go on. So, thank you for that question. These policies that the British enacted were central, right? Sometimes they took different colors in various parts, but usually they were central, and they were, without regard to the kind of place and environment that they corresponded to, they had the same kind of, effect. So here, the policies were similar, but there were certain other things that were enacted. For example, canals, they're rooted in extractive practices. So the canals that were built there, that was thought of as a frontier. So there was you must have heard about the primary frontier and the secondary frontier in the Punjab region. That extended to this area as well, right? The canal actually was meant to sedentarize the people so that the people don't move around. So mobile tribes, mobile people were always thought of as extremely threatening to the colonial dominance. Yeah, and they were thought of sometimes as informants and spies and things of that sort. So they were, pastoralism is disincentivized in some extent, and sedentarization is something which is given incentive.
Please.
My name is Jaspal. I was in the philosophy department here a long time ago. Thank you very much, Nilanjana, for these presentations. My ancestor moved from Jaisalmer and Bharatpur around 800 years ago into Punjab. And so I've been sort of looking at Pali texts. For example, Fayan, he mentions a lot about this area.
Okay.
So does Itzing. And Al-Biruni actually has a map of this area, and also the Pali Jatak tales, the Buddhist story, because Pushkar, Chittor, and Jaisalmer, they were great Buddhist centers. So these Jatak tales talk a lot about precisely I think these oral traditions may be continuation of those Jatak tales, because they talk in the same. And these borders, there's such a recent phenomenon, and also, some scholars suggest that this Rajput and Rajputana is a very recent construction. There was nothing like Rajput in any of the earlier literature. So I'm very, very happy that, you're doing this work and hope to see more of your work.
Wonderful. So we're going to take two final questions and that will wrap us up. So please.
Hello, so I'm Hitesh from the Nitin Institute. Thank you very much for this presentation. It's really fascinating. As a Rajput, I want to say that, of course, we go back to the beginning of all time. But more seriously, I also actually wanted to pick up on what Jaspalji was saying, which is, I'm from an adjacent area, which is not nearly as dry. Well, even this is not actually dry in the way that, say, the Middle East is, as we deserts are different. But, and there is actually a vast trove of literature from the Sanskrit, Prakrit Pali, starting in the 6th, 7th century in an idiom called Dingal. And then if you've looked at the Dingal sources, because in Saurashtra, where I'm from, there's a vast trove of Dingal literature, which is both oral, but it's also courtly, only in the sense of, say, a court like the one that my family belonged to, which is a very tiny place, smaller than Luxembourg, but there was a courtly literature, and it preserves, of course, heroic tales, as we have in the Rajasthani Rajas, but also very detailed folk life, right? And even contractual agreements. So many of the Dingle stories are about someone is about to graze his horses or his camels or his cows somewhere where they've historically done, and some tyrannical landlord or king says, no, you can't. But then there's a whole history showing that you can. And there's a battle, there's bloodshed. So it's a heroic tale, but it's a tale of a historic contract. So I'm wondering if you encountered some of this and knowing in Saurashtra, the relationships between neighboring kingdoms, for example. So when these groups moved across kingdoms, there were long-standing ritual agreements about their rights and responsibilities. Of course, they were violated all the time too, but they were certainly there, and those are also preserved in the Dingle oral literature, which is still recited to this day in Saurashtra. You still get 10,000 people at a recitation of these traditional stories. My family does one every year, which gets thousands of people. So I wonder if you've looked at this Dingle literature and the Apabhramsha literature that comes after it, which includes the Rasos, the Rajasthani tales, as one subgenre.
I haven't looked at them, but I know about them. The Charan literature.
The Charan literature
Yeah.
is especially what I.
Yeah. Yeah, the Charan literature, most of that were actually commissioned too. I mean, they were courtiers and they had to write that kind of records only to please their patrons. So it is not. I think it's a mediated tradition. Yes.
I think not Bangalore, but in Saurashtra, merchants and other guilds also commission charans. So merchant guilds would also commission the charan bards to write about them. So, and which is, and actually charan literature is behind all the vocabulary that Mahatma Gandhi uses. So all the vocabulary he uses for civil disobedience, fast unto death, sit down, strike, moving away, harta. That all comes directly out of Charan literature, and he comes from one of those movements. His father is the Prime Minister.
So Charan literature is something which I did, I studied for one of my earlier papers, which was also, one of the questions which I missed out, sorry, is about the partition and the remnants of, this culture having its impact on the national imagination of heroism, patriotism, and also, a seeing perception of land as motherland. That is a very central kind of a motif in Charan literature of thinking about land as motherland.
This is your work on Kali also.
Yes.
And Tagore.
Yes.
All right, last question.
Hi, Nilanjan. Thank you so much. This was a very fascinating talk. Really enjoyed it, and also everyone's comments here. My name is Nisha Mewada. I'm a second year PhD student in the joint program with History of Art and Architecture and Middle Eastern Studies. My question to you is coming from a very visual, coming from art history. architecture.
That's okay. That's okay.
I need to apologize.
You showed us this beautiful textile of Paguji's, the sacred textile. And I was wondering, of course, you're looking at a lot of oral history and, mapping these oral histories. You have done a great job, but I was just wondering if there is anything that you can extrapolate from these surviving, any kind of extent material that can help you in building your own archive and add to your story on, migration and, of course, movement, of course, connection with other regions. These were just very general thoughts.
Yes,
Great question.
Yes, thank you so much for that question. That is exactly what I want to do. I won't say I'm successful in doing. So, the reference to the Ravan Hatta and, the camels from Sri Lanka is precisely to, think about it as a connected place, as not as a place which is impervious to connection or mobility, but as a connected place and very well connected with other parts of the world. And especially with not only Central Asia, but also places, far-flung places across the sea route like Sri Lanka. About the textile, that's a very good question. India has always been a producer of textile. I was reading, reading up on trade and cotton and textile and dyes. These were the things that were exported from this area, this belt. And because of the land, the specific kind of climate that we have, cotton was a very important product, and again, the way that was weighed, it was always talked about as camel loads of so many camel loads, 30,000 camel loads. So that was a unit of measurement, right? So, yeah. So, yes. So that is the way, so clothes, textiles, these are another way of, proving that connection and connectivity and also interaction with other cultures. That's a very, very valid and interesting dimension. And I would love to, take that forward through that angle as well.
I just wanted to add, since we have an art historian as a moderator, that what I also noticed in that factor that you showed.
Can you just go on to that?
that
I cannot. Okay. This is the one or the?
Yeah, yeah.
Other one, go there is.
This is the address, yeah.
No, I mean
The par,
The Pabuji.
Yeah.
Pabuji's par,
So
yeah.
what I noticed about the narrative technique in the way of structuring it physically, it's I mean, on a very folk register, it's exactly the same narrative technique used in Ajanta. Right, where you use architecture but tell multiple stories through the same pavilion. For example, in the way characters move in and out, are moving in and out, it seems as if it's almost in motion. So also the size of the characters, so the most important character is significantly larger, and actually one of the kind of seminal papers on this in Ajanta is it shows if you take a Jataka story of the Buddha, the disproportionate number of words given to the Buddha exactly corresponds to the disproportionate size of the Buddha in the Ajanta cave painting. And the smaller characters are smaller, just as they get fewer words in the narrative literature. So here you have some of those issues also going on. But again, the way physical juxtapositions in the way characters are adjacent to them or juxtaposed to them is exactly how Ajanta. I mean, this is a much more folk register, obviously, but then the structures narrative.
Even in the stone calligraphy, you see the same.
Exactly.
Arjuna is, I think it's the descent of Arjuna and the Ganges River, it's the same calligraphy.
That also reminds me of Pitchwise and Matani.
Yes.
They are also arranged
In the
similar
same way, in the
context.
same similar way.
Trans-geographical going from the descent of the Ganges all the way in South India to, Australia.
So the hero gets most amount of, the space.
Or the heroine, because you'll see also in the Ajanta paintings, the heroine is much larger than the smaller characters, because that's how many words would be given to her in the actual narrative of the Ajanta painting.
It's always a great sign with a talk where the conversation seems to never end, but unfortunately, we do have to bring it to a close. So let's thank Nilanjana once again.